Justice Barrett, thank you for inviting us here to the Supreme Court.
I'm so happy you came.
It's interesting to look around this room, and there's all men.
True.
No women on the walls, all of them Chief Justices, right?
Well, they're all Chief Justices, so there have been no female chiefs to display as of yet.
Mm-hmm. How do you see how the highest court in the land has evolved since the Constitution in 1787?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. So the Supreme Court is actually the only federal court that's actually created by the Constitution. All the other federal courts were created at Congress's choice. And the Supreme Court it started out without any precedent on the books. It had to forge its own way and develop the law just on the basis of the documents. Over time, it got more sophisticated because, well, I think it was always sophisticated. That's not fair to my predecessors, but the number of precedents really swelled. And over time, it really established itself as a strong, independent, coordinate branch of government.
Mm-hmm. You play a unique role on this court. And legal observers that I have spoken with say, they can usually predict how the liberal justices may rule or how the conservative justices may decide, but that you can be unpredictable. In fact, you've been described to me as the most influential justice on the Supreme Court today. How do you see your role?
Well, I think every justice on the court is unique, and every justice on the court is influential. So in that regard, I don't see myself as any different. I see myself as just having the job of listening to the law, of getting the job done. So my job is to decide each case as it comes, and I don't go in with any kind of preconceived notion of where I ought to end up. I just follow the law where it goes.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean, listening to the law for you? Because it does mean something different for each justice.
Well, I actually don't think it means something different for each justice. Each justice goes to the case, to the briefs, to the law, to the cases, to all of the authorities that lead us to the right result. And each justice is trying to get it right. Now, it's true that sometimes people wind up at different answers, but it's not because they're dealing with different questions or different sources. It's just because law is hard, and the cases that the Supreme Court takes are ones in which lower courts have disagreed.
This is your first television interview since joining the court.
That is true.
How many years ago?
5.
Yeah. So it's rare.
Yes, it is.
It's rare for journalists or anyone to get to sit down and talk to a Supreme Court justice. So let's get straight to it. President Donald Trump appointed you to cement a conservative legal revolution. Are you concerned about the narrative of this court that it is no longer a separate and co-equal branch of government as designed by the Constitution?
Well, let's see. I disagree with that conception of the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is an independent branch of government. And presidents appoint justices, and presidents have whatever their own motivations are for appointing justices. But once justices serve on the court, the whole point of life tenure and salary protection, which is guaranteed to federal judges by the Constitution, is to ensure their independence from both the executive branch and from Congress.
But does the reputation of the Supreme Court matter to you?
I want people to have trust in the court, and that's why I wrote this book, frankly. I wanted people to understand how the court works. I wanted them to understand how we get our cases and how we go about making our decisions, because the court belongs to every American. And I want Americans to feel like they have a stake in the court and they understand what the court does, because what the court does is not the same kind of work that Congress does, and it's not the same kind of work that the president does. Those are the political branches. The court is not one of the political branches.
And how does the Supreme Court make sure that it appears and works in an apolitical manner?
The court deals with the law, and the way that the Supreme Court works, as I describe in the book, isn't political. We don't sit, when you look at the bench, this is one of the things I like to point out to children when they come and visit the court. We sit on the bench. It's not like Congress where you have Republicans on one side and Democrats on another. We sit in order of seniority, and we wear black robes. And we wear black robes because we show that we are there not representing any particular interest group, not representing any political party, but we are there to be neutral arbiters and to follow the law where it leads.
In June, this court handed President Trump what he called a monumental victory. That was lifting this nationwide injunction that would have blocked his attempt to deny citizenship to children born of undocumented immigrants on U.S. soil. You wrote the majority opinion in that case, Trump v. Casa, Inc. Why has the Supreme Court shown a willingness to let these controversial executive orders move forward?
Well, I wouldn't say the Supreme Court has shown a willingness to allow controversial executive orders to move forward. Like I said before, the court decides cases as they come, and each case presents its own unique challenges. And so in the book, I describe how the decision-making process works. It moves slowly. It's reading the briefs, it's listening to arguments, it's talking to law clerks, it's talking to colleagues. So, each case gets a lot of attention, and each case requires a lot of analysis and discussion and thought and writing.
But some observers of the court would say that granting or looking at these emergency orders from the president is not allowing the court to move slowly.
Well, the emergency orders present a challenge because they do require the work of the court to proceed far more quickly than it normally does. I pointed out in the book that there are turtles all over the court because normally the court moves slowly, it changes slowly, justice moves slowly at the court because we are very deliberate. The emergency docket moves much more quickly, and it is a much more recent phenomenon. So I would say that, I describe in the book the way that oral argument has grown and developed over 200 years. It's taken us to kind of settle into the way that we do arguments and opinions. The emergency docket is newer, and so I would say those processes are still being shaped and sorted out.
Help people understand that, because as you know, there are a lot of questions about the emergency docket and the Supreme Court's decisions with regard to the emergency docket in this last term. For people, generally speaking, President Trump came in promising big and bold reforms, right? He issued a lot of executive orders. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Lower courts in some cases said that those were unconstitutional. And then the president essentially appealing those came to the Supreme Court, correct?
So the way that emergency orders work is they're essentially motions. And motions used to be pretty sleepy in appellate courts. When I was on the Seventh Circuit, I would serve on a motions panel for 3 weeks at a time, and I maybe wrote 2 or 3 paragraphs once. It was not a heavy lift, and it really wasn't that different at the Supreme Court. When I was a law clerk, the only emergency motions that we had were in capital cases and death penalty cases. And so that has really picked up.
Yeah, why has that changed, do you think, with this president?
Well, I don't know that it started actually several administrations ago. And I think that it has accelerated with each administration. We had plenty of emergency docket activity in the last, I've only been on the court in the Biden administration and this most recent one. We have plenty of emergency docket action last term, and people have been noticing that even terms before that. So it's been on an incline, and I don't know the reasons for that, but essentially what an emergency request asks is for the court to intervene immediately because, Justice Kavanaugh has written calling it the interim docket or interim orders, because something has to be said as a status quo while litigation proceeds. So the emergency docket does not resolve anything finally. It's just a holding. It just says, here's what we're going to do. We're either going to pause this or not pause this while things play out more fully in the courts below.
So help explain what happened in the Trump v. Casa, Inc. case, which was multiple cases, right? Which lower courts were concerned about the constitutionality of President Trump's effort to deny birthright citizenship.
Yes. Actually, that's a really good case to bring up because it shows how this process plays out and how this process works. So a lot of people thought that that case was about birthright citizenship, but the birthright citizenship question was not before us, and we did not analyze that question at all. The only question that was before us was a question that would sound arcane if you stopped someone on the street and asked them in any other context. It was whether the Judiciary Act of 1789 authorizes district courts to enter what's called universal relief, which is injunctions against non-parties. Very technical issue. One, as a former procedure teacher, I find very interesting, but my guess is that you would not be gripped by that question.
But in effect, and I may read for those what Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she dissented, and she accused the majority, of which you're a part of, in her words, hastening the downfall of our government institutions. And she wrote in her dissent, a Martian arriving here from another planet would see these circumstances and surely wonder, what good is the Constitution then? Will your decision embolden the executive to act more as a monarchy than a democracy, as Justice Jackson suggested?
So Justice Jackson wrote an opinion speaking only for herself, and you're right, Justice Jackson's position in that case was that she thought that this would, as you say, embolden the executive. The majority, opinion disagreed, and as I said, Justice Jackson wrote a solo dissent, writing only for herself. This case wasn't about what the president can or cannot do. The case was about the authority of the district courts, the authority of the federal courts. And I think one important theme throughout history, one important theme of the book, is that federal courts have to be attentive to the limits of their power. And from the beginning, actually, I tell a story in the book about George Washington trying to pull the Supreme Court into a dispute about international law. And the court said, this isn't something that we're going to get involved in because the Constitution only authorizes us to decide cases and controversies, essentially, is how that doctrine has developed. So courts can't decide every question. Courts can't leap in all of the time.
But does your opinion essentially drastically alter the ability of courts to check presidential power?
Well, the Judiciary Act of 1789 gives district courts ability to enter what are called equitable injunctions, equitable relief. It does not authorize courts to enter this particular kind of relief. As the opinion says, there may be other kinds of relief that's broader that courts have the authority to enter. The universal injunction, as courts had entered it in that case, isn't one.
I know that you clerked for Justice Scalia, who was known to have a sharp pen, and you appeared to have a sharp pen in your remarks responding to Justice Jackson. Why did you feel the need to do that?
I think, my default mode isn't to write sharply. And I want to point out, I kind of feel like I always have to say this. One of my colleagues, when I first became a judge, pointed this out, that a majority opinion, even though the author drafts it, is one that speaks for the court.
Looking for great hotel prices? Plan your perfect stay with Agoda. Cozy, fancy, or budget-friendly, we've